My name is Miranda Sorrell and I was 34 the fall my dad died. 6 weeks after we buried him, my brother sold dad's truck out of the shed without asking a single person. He told my mom it was just sitting there getting old. Then the man who bought it called me instead of him. He'd gone under the bed of that truck to check the spare before a long haul, and taped to the top of it was a sealed envelope with my name on it in my dad's handwriting. Inside were two things. A letter my dad wrote 3 days before he died and a deed. I didn't say one word to my family about it for 23 days. What happened at Thanksgiving in front of everyone is the part they still won't talk about. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge. This is where we sit with the quiet ones. The people who kept the peace in their families for years, until keeping it started costing them everything. And we follow what happens the day they finally stop keeping it. If that sounds like somebody you know, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. We buried my dad on a Wednesday, the second week of September, out of the funeral home on the square in Ellery. I picked the casket. I wrote the obituary and read it 4 times, looking for the word I'd spelled wrong. I called the church about the meal and told them 80 and 73 came. And I have thought about those 7 empty chairs more than I should. My brother Neil stood at the door in a good jacket and shook every hand that came through it. He said, "Thank you for coming," about 100 times in that soft voice men use at funerals. People took his hand in both of theirs. My mother cried in the front pew at exactly the right moments and told Rhonda Beckhart loud enough for the second row. Thank the Lord for Neil. I sat on the end and held my dad's reading glasses in my coat pocket because I hadn't figured out where else to put them. Here is the part I want you to understand before anything else happens. I buried my dad on a Wednesday and I sorted mail on a Thursday because Route 2 doesn't care what kind of week you're having and there was nobody else in the office qualified to run it. 412 boxes. I know every one of them. I know which mailbox has the loose door, and which one has a wasp nest in July, and which old man waits at the end of his lane at 10:40 because his daughter writes on Tuesdays. That's who I was in that family. The one who knew where everything went. Nobody said one single thing about the property that week. Not one word. That was the last quiet week we had. My dad had congestive heart failure for 2 years before it took him. And in those 2 years, I drove him to 61 appointments. I know it was 61 because I wrote every one of them in the pad I keep on the dash. I slept 4 nights in a hospital chair in Heron. I paid his electric bill in February, when the disability check ran late and I never told him I did it, which is its own kind of stupid, because he found out anyway from the co-op. Neil came out about once a month. He brought a bakery pie and stayed 40 minutes and sat where my dad could see him. And my mother talked about that visit for the rest of the week. That's not me being bitter. That's just the arithmetic of it. In June, I asked my mother a plain question at the kitchen table. I asked whether Dad had a will and where the deed to the place was kept. She didn't even look up from the beans. You worry about the kitchen, honey. Let your brother worry about the man things. I let it go the way I'd been letting things go since I was 19. I want to be honest with you about my own part in this, because it matters later. I believe that doing the work was the same thing as having a say. It isn't. It's just doing the work. Every time I quietly handled something, I taught those people that I would always handle it and never ask for a vote. That was on me. There was one thing from that summer I didn't think about until much later. Dad Snorts asked me out of nowhere if I still remembered how to mark timber with paint. I said, sure. He nodded and didn't explain, and I didn't ask. 3 days before he died on a Wednesday, I came out to the home place after my route and found him on the back steps with his color gone gray. He'd been somewhere. His good shirt was buttoned wrong at the collar and Odessa's car was just pulling out of the lane. I asked where he'd been. Went and signed some odds and ends, he said, and waved it off like a fly. He was breathing in that shallow way that made me count without meaning to. I sat down on the step below him, and we watched the ridge go orange. Then he said, casual as a weather report, that spare under the truck's low. Get under there and look at it when you've got a minute. I told him I'd do it right then. I had a compressor in my trunk, and it would take me 10 minutes. He said, no, it would keep. I asked him a second time. I said, Dad, if you're driving on a bad spare, I'd rather know now. He shook his head. It'll keep till the weekend. So, I wrote it in the little pad I keep on the dash of my mail car, the one where I write which lanes are washed out. Sat spare Dad's truck. That Saturday morning, my mother called me at 6:40. I want you to sit with one thing about that conversation on the steps because I've sat with it for a long time. My dad was the man who checked the tires. He checked mine before every winter for 19 years and told me the tread was getting slick like it was a personal insult. In his whole life, he never once asked me to check a tire for him. 9 days after the funeral, I drove the 9 miles out to the home place with that compressor still rolling around in my trunk. The shed had a brass padlock on it that had never been there before. I stood in the gravel and looked at it for a while. The way you look at a word you don't recognize in a language you speak, my mother said. Neil, put it on. There's people who'd help themselves to your dad's tools, Miranda, I said. Which people out here 4 miles from the blacktop? And she looked at me like I'd been rude. Neil kept the only key because Neil was going to come out every week and start the truck so the battery wouldn't die. I asked him for a copy 3 times over 3 weeks. The first time he said it was in his other truck. The second time he said he'd bring it Sunday. The third time he didn't pick up, and then he texted me a thumbs up, which I've come to understand is what a man sends when he wants the conversation over. When I pushed once more, he called me from a gas station with the pump beeping behind him and used the voice he uses on customers he's about to charge for a part they didn't need. It's Mom's shed, not yours. Don't make this weird. And then light, almost friendly, the way you'd tease somebody at a cookout. Stay in your lane, Miranda. You deliver things, you don't decide things. I said okay and hung up, because I had 11 boxes left on the North Loop, and because I have never in my life won an argument by being the second person to raise my voice. I told myself I'd get in that shed Saturday. By Saturday, the truck was gone. Before that though, there was the family meeting and I need you to see how that one went. My mother called me Sunday afternoon and said, "Come out. We're all going to sit down together." When I got there, Neil's truck had already cooled off in the drive, and there were 3 coffee cups on the table with rings dried in them. They'd been sitting for 40 minutes. Yvette, my brother's wife, had a legal pad. Neil ran it like a job estimate. Mom needed a roof, and he had a bid for $14,800, and the timber outback was just sitting there eating tax money every year. He said, "Eating tax money twice." Yvette put her hand on my wrist and said, "I'm only saying this because I love this family." I asked exactly one question. I asked whose name the ground was in. The table went quiet for about 2 seconds, which in that house is a long time. My mother said it was in my dad's name, and then she said, "It's the whole family's now." I asked what my part of that was supposed to look like. And my mother reached over and patted my hand and used the sweet voice, the one she uses at the church door. And she said it in front of both of them without a flicker. "You don't get land, Miranda. You get keepsakes." Neil looked at his phone. Then he said offhand that he'd already talked to a fella about it, and before I could ask which fella, he was up getting more coffee and telling Yvette they needed to leave by 4. I went out and sat in my car in the yard for 3 minutes before I started it. And I couldn't have told you why. 6 weeks after we buried him, on the last Saturday in October, I drove out with a pan of apple crisp for my mother, and the shed door was standing wide open. Where my dad's truck had sat since I was in grade school, there was a rectangle of clean concrete with an oil shadow in the middle of it. I stood in that doorway holding a warm pan. My mother came out on the steps and said it like it was nothing. "It was just sitting, honey. Neil said it had go to ruin, 9,200. She had 2,000 of it in a bank envelope on the counter and she'd already put a rubber band around it." I asked who bought it. She didn't know, she hadn't asked. Her snorts. I texted Neil and he wrote back inside a minute. "Handled it. Don't make a thing out of this. Let me tell you about that truck so you understand what was in that shed." It was a moss green half-tone with a bench seat my dad had reupholstered the year I turned 16 in a fabric my mother hated. There was a dent in the driver's door I put there myself backing into a fence post at 17 and he never fixed it. And every single time somebody mentioned it, he'd say, "That's how I know it's mine." I didn't want that truck. I want to be clear because I've had people assume otherwise. I didn't want the truck. I wanted to be asked. I drove home and put the apple crisp in my own refrigerator and ate exactly none of it. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang with a number from the next county over. If you've ever learned something about your own family from a total stranger, then you already know what my stomach did when that number came up. Stay with me on this one. The part that turned it all around is taped under a tire and it's about 2 minutes from here. Hit subscribe so you don't lose the rest of it. The man's name was Emtt Vashon, 63, retired lineman, 41 aired east in the next county, and he talked like a man who has never once been in a hurry. He said he'd bought a green Halfton off a fella out of Ellery, and he was fixing to pull a hay trailer with it. So he dropped the spare down out from under the bed to put air in it. He said there was an envelope taped to the top side of the tire. The flat part that faces up under the truck wrapped in 2 freezer bags with silver duct tape over the whole business. He said the name on it was Miranda, just Miranda in carpenter pencil and block letters. He'd called the post office in Ellery and asked whether there was a sorrel working there, because he figured a name like that, in a town that size, wouldn't be hard. And Dale gave him my cell without asking me first, which I have never once complained about. Here is the thing about Empt Vashon that I think about more than I expected to. He didn't open it. A man buys a truck, finds an envelope hidden under it, and every reason in the world says, look inside. He drove it around for 3 days trying to find the right person instead. I asked if I could come get it. He said he'd be on the porch. I drove 41 miles that same afternoon in my own car with my uniform shirt still on. He met me in the yard with the envelope held in both hands like it was a plate somebody had asked him to carry. He handed it over and he said one thing to me before I left. Somebody went to a lot of trouble making sure this found you and nobody else. I put it on the passenger seat and drove 9 miles home with my hand flat on top of it, like it might go out the window. I didn't open it at his house and I didn't open it in my kitchen. I drove out Quarry Road past the home place with the lights already on, in my mother's front room, and I pulled off at the head of the log road that goes back into the 84 acres, and I sat there with the engine off and the windows down. Then I slit the tape with the letter opener I keep in the door of my car. 2 things came out. The first was heavy paper folded in thirds with a heading printed across the top that said warranty deed. It was dated that Wednesday, 3 days before he died. Grantor Lowood R. Sorrel. Grantee Miranda K. Sorrel. Then a whole paragraph of surveyor's language about the north half of the northeast quarter and a road running along the west line. Which is how the law talks about a place where you learn to walk. His signature was at the bottom in the tight cramped hand he used when he was being careful. Under it was a notary seal and the name in the seal was O. Fenn. The second thing was 1 sheet of yellow legal paper written in block capitals front and back. I'm not going to give you all of it right now because there's a place further on where it belongs. I'll give you the line I read 4 times sitting in that car with a deer standing at the far end of the log road watching me. He wrote, I didn't leave it to you because you're my daughter. I left it to you because you're the one who walks it. I sat there about 20 minutes. Then I did the only thing I actually knew how to do. I photographed both sides of both pages, put the originals in a stiff envelope, wrote the date on the flap, and told absolutely nobody. I've handled a lot of important mail in 9 years. I had never held anything addressed to me by a dead man. The next morning, off the clock, I walked 6 blocks from my house to the square and up the stairs across from the courthouse to Ingrid Enquist's office. The $150 for an hour. I paid it on my own card and I have the receipt to this day. She read the deed twice without saying anything, and then she asked me where I got it. And when I told her the whole business about the spare tire, she set her pen down. Here's what she told me. And she said it in plain words, which is why I'm able to repeat it. A deed doesn't work just because a man signs it. He has to hand it over while he's alive. He has to actually let go of it on purpose. Meaning it signing isn't enough. Putting it in a drawer isn't enough. Then she asked me the question that kept me up for a week. Is duct tape under a tire handing it over or is it hiding it? I said I didn't know. She said neither did she, and that's the whole fight. Then she told me the second half. Recording it down at the courthouse doesn't make a bad deed good, but it puts the whole world on notice. And in this state, if you record first and you're honest about it, the law protects you against whoever tries to buy it out from under you afterward. Her last piece of advice was the hardest thing anybody asked of me that year. Don't tell your family yet. Not until you can show what your dad meant to do. Your brother doesn't have to win, she said. Hen snorts, he only has to sell it before you can prove it. I asked how long it takes to prove intent. She looked at the calendar on her wall. When are they selling? That Sunday. I ate pot roast at my mother's table with a photocopy of my father's deed lying in a folder in the trunk of my car 50 feet away under a bag of road salt. If you have never had to sit and pass the butter while somebody lies about your dad, I don't have a good way to describe it. My mother started building her story that night, and she wasn't even sly about it. She told Yvette that Woody got confused there at the end. She said he called her by his own mother's name one evening. She has snort said he'd sign anything you put in front of him those last weeks. Poor thing. Yvette made a sympathetic noise and wrote nothing down, and my mother looked at me for 1/2 second to see if it had landed. It had. I knew exactly what she was laying track for, because it's the only argument they had. He wasn't in his right mind. And I knew sitting there with gravy on my plate that if I opened my mouth, I'd be handing them 3 weeks of warning. So I said the roast was good. Neil said a fellow was coming down next week to walk the back 40. My mother said, well, isn't that good? I washed every dish in that kitchen, wiped the counters down, and left at 7, the way I always do. I washed every dish in that house and didn't say the one sentence that would have ended the meal. On my way to my car, I passed Neil's truck in the dark. There was a folder on the passenger seat, dark green, with some kind of leaf printed on the corner of it. I couldn't read the name from where I was standing. I could read the shape of it. Tuesday on my route, I put a business envelope in a box out at Fairlawn and stopped with my hand still in the door. Same leaf, Underhill Hardwood out of Wexford. Now, I want to say this clearly because it matters to me and it ought to matter to you. I did not open that envelope. I don't open anybody's mail. Not my brother's, not a stranger's. Not on the worst day of my life. What I did instead was finish my loop, park, and call Underhill Hardwood from my own phone like any woman in the county might. I hen snorts asked whether they had a job coming up on Quarry Road. The girl on the phone didn't even pause. The sorrel tracked cruise in the Monday after Thanksgiving, I asked, and I made myself sound bored. What kind of cut it was, she said clear cut. Everything merchantable, stem to stem, then chip whatever's left. My dad marked timber with blue paint for 40 years. He'd walk a stand in October and put a stripe on the ones to take and leave the rest standing so the next fellow would know what he was looking at. He sold standing timber 3 times in his whole life. And both times before this one, he cried about it in the shop where he thought nobody could hear him. They were going to leave nothing. 9 days with a feller buncher and 84 acres would look like a parking lot with stumps in it. I sat in my car in the post office lot and did the math on the calendar. It was the 7th day since I'd opened that envelope. There were 16 days left. And I still didn't know what my brother had signed, as because he doesn't own 1 square inch of that ground. Ingrid found out for me with 1 phone call to a man she'd done closings with for years. Neil signed the timber contract as the representative of my father's estate. He gave them a certified copy of the death certificate and a letter of authorization with my mother's signature on it. Not forged, signed. She sat at some table with a pen in her hand and put her name on it. I read it 3 times off Ingrid's notepad before it went all the way down. There's a thing about timber deals out here that nobody thinks about until it happens to them. A standing timber contract gets signed on a handshake and a quick look at the tax rolls because it's a crop, not a house. Underhill wasn't going to run a full title search until right before the contract closed, which was the week after Thanksgiving. Until then, they were operating on trust and a death certificate. Ingrid tapped her pen on the desk twice and gave me the sentence the whole rest of this turns on. If you record that deed, and then you give them written notice, you can prove they received. Then from that minute on they are not innocent buyers anymore. Nobody in this deal gets to say they didn't know. That night, my mother called about something else entirely and read a text from Neil out loud without thinking the way she does. Once the crew's in, it's done. Nobody unrings that bell. I asked Ingrid the next morning what it takes to prove a dead man's intent. She held up 3 fingers, sworn testimony from whoever watched him sign, a written record of him treating the ground like it was already mine, and the deed itself on record. I had one of the 3. Odessa Fan is 74 and she was the secretary at Ellery High for 31 years, which means she has known everybody in this county since they were 14 and stupid. She keeps her notary stamp and works a side desk at the insurance office on the square 2 days a week. When I walked in, she said my name before I got the door shut. And then she said, "I've been waiting on you, honey." And my eyes went hot and I got them back. She remembered that Wednesday exactly. She remembered it. She said, because Woody Sherrill was the only man in 30 years of notarizing who brought his own chair. He carried a folding lawn chair in from his truck and set it down in front of her desk and sat in it. She said he came in with a deed already typed up, and he read the whole thing through one more time out loud under his breath before he'd take the pen. He snorts, and she said before he signed, he told her something. He looked up and he said, "I want it to be hers starting today. I just don't want her fighting with her mother about it, while I'm still here to hear it. She said she'd swear to that. She said she'd put it in an affidavit in front of another notary at the courthouse and sign her name to it, knowing what perjury is. She didn't have a notebook to hand me, and I didn't ask for one. What she had was her memory and a willingness to put it under oath. Then she said one more thing offhand, gathering up her cardigan. He asked me that day if I remembered whether he'd already filed his forestry paperwork over at Wexford from the year before. I was on the road to Wexford by 7 the next morning. The district forestry office in Wexford is a brick building with a gravel lot and a counter that has a bell on it. I filled out a records request, sat in a plastic chair for 25 minutes, and paid $3 for copies. What the woman brought back was a folder about as thick as a magazine, a multi-year forest management plan for 84 acres in Ellery County filed 14 months before my father died. Stand maps, a schedule of thinnings out to the year I'll turn 50. Stapled to it, a cost-share agreement for timber stand improvement under the state program with the acreage, and the parcel number typed in. And down at the bottom on the line that says landowner and cooperator, there were 2 signatures, Lowood R. Sorrell and Miranda K. Sorrell mine. I stood at that counter and I could not for the life of me remember signing it. And then all at once I could. A Tuesday evening in July, the summer before last, he pushed 3 sheets across the kitchen table at me while I was standing at the stove reheating his supper because he wouldn't eat at 5 like the doctor said. He said, "Sign right there for me. It's just forestry paper." I signed all 3 without reading them because his beans were scorching. I had been carrying the proof for 14 months and never once knew it. I went out and sat on the tailgate of somebody else's truck in that gravel lot and read my father's letter all the way through for the first time. He wrote that he'd started moving it a year and a half back, a little at a time, so it would be done and quiet. He wrote that he knew what Neil would do the minute he was in the ground, and that he'd known it for years and hated knowing it. He wrote that he didn't have another fight with my mother left in him, and that he was sorry to hand me the fight instead. And he wrote the line again at the bottom, underlined twice. "I left it to you because you're the one who walks it." He didn't hide it from me. He hid it from the argument. That afternoon, I stopped being a person that things were happening to. By the middle of the next week, I bet had gotten out in front of it. She put it on the church prayer chain, which in this county is faster than the internet and harder to correct. "Please pray for our family. There's a dispute over land. Please especially pray for my mother-in-law, who is grieving and being put through this." She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. By Thursday, I had 3 people on my own route ask me questions with their eyes down. Mrs. Voth, who is 71 and has never once softened anything in her life, came all the way out to her box in her house coat and asked me flat, "Honey, is it true you're suing your mother?" I said, "No, ma'am." I said I hadn't filed anything against anybody and I wasn't planning to. And then I said the only thing I let myself say for 3 weeks. "I'm not doing one thing I'd have to whisper about." She looked at me a second, and then she said something I wasn't ready for. She said my dad had stopped by her place the summer before last. He'd sat on her porch and drunk a glass of tea and asked her for the phone number of the lawyer who'd done her husband's papers. She said she gave it to him and he wrote it on the back of a feed store receipt. My mother called me that night crying so hard I could hear the wet in it. She said I had humiliated her in front of the whole church. She said she couldn't show her face at Wednesday supper. I said I loved her and I had to be up at 4:30 and I hung up and I stood in my kitchen with my hand still on the phone. Mrs. Voth is also on the Thanksgiving list every year. 2 days after that, my mother called sweet as pie and said, "Come out. I've got your part set aside." There was a banana box on the kitchen table. In it were 6 of my dad's ball caps, his reading glasses, a folding knife with the blade worn down to a sliver, a cloth tape measure, and my parents' wedding picture in a frame with a crack running through the glass at the corner. I stood there with my hands on the box, and my mother said it again with her eyes shining in that voice she saves for the front steps of the church. "You don't get land, honey, you get keepsakes." Then she slid a piece of paper across the table at me. It was typed, "Disclaimer of interest." My name was already printed at the bottom over a signature line spelled right, middle initial and all. There was a print shop stamp on the back corner with a date on it. And the date was the day after the family meeting, which meant it had been sitting in my brother's truck for 3 weeks waiting for a good moment. Yvette had a pen out of her purse before I'd finished reading the first paragraph. My mother said, "It's just a formality, sweetheart. It keeps the peace. I picked up the pen. I want to be honest. I did pick it up. Then I set it back down on the table and said I'd read it at home, and my mother's face did something I'd never seen it do. I carried that box out to my car. When I set it on the seat, the reading glasses slid out of the fold of a cap, and there was a scrap of paper folded into the temple arm in block capitals. Waxford, second file. Neil was waiting in the post office lot at 400 on Monday, parked crossways behind my car, so I couldn't back out. He got out and leaned on my fender with his arms folded, and he kept his voice up because Dale and a clerk named Pam were loading trays 15 feet away, and he wanted them to hear the reasonable brother. He asked about the paper. He said, "Mom's roof leaks into a bucket in the back bedroom, and had I been in that bedroom lately?" He said, "The family needs money, not principles." I said, "I don't sign things the same day I read them, and I never have." And he knew that about me. He laughed. Not mean, worse than mean. He laughed like I'd said something charming at a wedding, and he leaned in and said it again. The same words, slower this time so I'd get it. "You deliver things, Miranda. You don't decide things." And then he got a little too pleased with himself the way he always does about 10 seconds after he thinks he's won. He said Monday after Thanksgiving it's all done, and then this whole thing goes away and everybody forgets about it by Christmas. Dale walked over with a tray on his hip and asked me real casual if everything was all right out here. Neil said we're fine, buddy. Dale didn't move. Neil got in his truck and backed out. I stood there in the cold with my keys in my hand, and I thought about 3 certified stamps and who exactly I would want signing for them. I've been delivering things for 9 years. He'd never once stood behind me at that counter. You would be surprised what people sign for without reading a word of it. That night I sat at my own kitchen table on Pike Street until 11 with 4 things laid out in front of me, one at each corner like place settings. The disclaimer, the deed, the forestry file, the letter. I made myself go through the whole ledger out loud in my own house because nobody else was ever going to read it back to me. 61 appointments, 4 nights in a chair in her. The February electric bill, the Christmas Eve I spent under the sink at the home place with a pipe wrench while everybody ate. Snorts, the 3 years I made my mother's Sunday roast because she couldn't read a recipe after her eyes went. And what I got for all of it was a banana box and a typed page with my name already printed at the bottom. I sat there dried, and I did not tear that disclaimer in half. And I want to tell you why. Because it's the only thing I did that whole month that I'm actually proud of. Tearing it up would have felt good for 9 seconds. Instead, I put it in a folder, wrote the date I received it on the tab, and filed it with the rest. Every time I had absorbed something quietly, I had taught those people that I'd never ask for a vote. That was over now, and it wasn't going to be over because I yelled. I wasn't going to argue with my mother. I was going to file. At 7 the next morning, I called the office and took a half day, which I had not done in 4 years. And Dale asked me twice if I was sick. The recorder's office in the Ellery County Courthouse is on the ground floor down a hall that smells like floor wax and old radiators. And there's a wooden counter worn pale in 2 spots where people have been leaning on it since before my father was born. I walked 6 blocks in my own coat, not my uniform, on my own time. The clerk was a woman about my age with a cardigan and reading glasses on a chain, and she was not impressed by anything, which I appreciated. She looked at the deed. She checked the legal description against the plat book without being asked. She handed me a real estate transfer declaration and a grantor-grantee statement and pointed at the boxes with a pen. I filled them in standing up. She caught one thing I'd left blank, where the tax bills should be mailed, and I wrote in my own address on Pike Street and initialed it. Then she stamped the top right corner with a machine that goes chunk, and she wrote a document number on it in ballpoint, and she told me the fee, and I wrote her a personal check for it. That was it. She handed me back a certified copy with the county seal pressed into it and said, "You'll want to keep that somewhere dry, hun." It took 19 minutes and cost me less than a tank of gas. I want to be honest about how it felt, because I had expected something and I got something else. It did not feel like winning. It felt like finally getting a letter to the right house, after it had been going to the wrong one for a year. I stood on the courthouse steps in the cold with that copy in a plastic sleeve inside my coat. And I understood 2 things at the same time. My brother's whole plan was now a lie he had already told other people. And nobody in the world knew it yet, which meant it wasn't worth a thing. If you're watching this and your folks are still here, ask them one question tonight. Not how much, not who gets what, just this. Where is it written down and who has a copy? It took a dead man's handwriting under a spare tire for me to learn that. If this is landing somewhere for you, drop a comment and subscribe and let me finish telling it. The next day, I mailed 3 letters, and I did it at the retail window of the same post office where I work after my shift, out of my own wallet. I want to say why, because somebody always asks if I had run those through the back or used one strip of office tape. My brother would have spent the rest of his life telling people I used my government job against my own mother. So I stood in line behind Mr. Ostrander and his Christmas boxes like anybody else. And Pam waited on me and I paid retail. Certified mail return receipt requested, all 3. The first went to Underhill Hardwood in Wexford with a copy of the recorded deed, document number, and county stamp right there on the face of it. The second went to the attorney handling my father's estate, the one my mother hired, with the deed and a copy of Odessa's affidavit. The third went to the title company Underhill uses because Ingrid said the title company is the one that actually stops a closing. There was no threat in any of them. No lawyer language. No demands, no "you'll be hearing from anybody." Each one said the same plain thing. This ground is deed and recorded to me. Here's the number. Here's a copy. Please govern yourselves accordingly. Certified mail isn't for scaring people. It's for making sure that later on nobody gets to stand up and say they didn't know. And I did not send one to Neil. Ingrid was firm about that. The buyer is the one who takes the loss. And my brother was the only person in this who could still destroy something if you gave him a week's head start. 9 years on that road taught me the part most people get backwards. Sending it is not the important half. The important half is who signs. Thanksgiving was 8 days out. On Thursday, Odessa Fenn walked into the courthouse in her good coat and signed her affidavit in front of the notary from the county clerk's office, because a notary can't notarize her own statement. She wrote it out plain, that Woody Searle came into her office on the Wednesday in question, that he brought his own folding chair and sat in it, that he read the deed aloud under his breath before signing, and that he said he wanted it to be his daughter's starting that day, and only wanted to spare her a fight with her mother while he was living. She signed it knowing what perjury means, and she said so to my face on the courthouse steps. Then I went upstairs to the assessor's office and pulled the property card on the parcel, which anybody can do for the asking. The mailing address for the tax bill on those 84 acres had been changed the previous tax cycle. Hay Snorts changed to my post office box, on a form my father filled out and signed himself in April of the year before he died. Ingrid laid the 3 of them out on her desk side by side. The forestry plan with my name on the landowner line, the tax card, the sworn statement. She tapped each one with 2 fingers. "This isn't a piece of paper somebody found under a tire," she said. "This is a man doing the same thing over and over for 14 months. Then she asked me how I wanted to play it. She said we could file a suit Monday and let my brother sweat straight through the holiday. And honestly, she looked like she'd enjoy it. Or I could let the mail do the work and keep my grandmother's dishes on the table." I picked the table. I did not know it then, but my brother had picked the table too. Friday, I drove out to the home place with my mother's blood pressure prescription because the pharmacy in Ellery closes at 5 and she can't drive since the cataract surgery. The television was off, which never happens. She was sitting in my dad's chair with his reading glasses on the end of her nose and a church bulletin in her lap that she wasn't reading. She didn't hear me come in. When she did, she didn't get up. She said, "Sit down a minute." So, I sat on the floor beside the chair the way I used to when I was 8. She said, 46 years. She said it to the window. Then she said the truest thing that woman has ever said to me. "Nobody tells you the house gets loud." She said she leaves the radio on all night in the kitchen. She said she goes to bed at 80:30 because she can't stand the last hour before it. She said she stands at the back door some mornings and looks at the shed and can't make herself walk out to it. For about 2 minutes, we were a mother and a daughter, and I had my hand on her ankle and neither of us said anything at all. Then she took hold of my wrist. Same voice. Exactly the same voice. And she said, "So you'll sign that paper for me so I can rest?" And when I didn't answer, she said the rest of it. "Your brother says, if you don't sign it, I'll have to go live with them." I sat there on the floor of that house, and I could hear which words were hers and which words had been handed to her. And I could have told you the exact afternoon she'd been given them. I said, "Mom, you aren't going anywhere ever." And I said, "I'm not signing anything tonight." And you can tell him I said that. On my way out, I walked past the shed. The brass padlock was hanging open on the HSP with the shackle cut clean through, and my dad's roll toolbox was gone. Monday, my supervisor called me into the little office behind the boxes and shut the door, which in 9 years had never happened. Somebody had phoned in a concern that a carrier was using the mail to interfere in a private family matter. He hand snorts didn't say my brother's name, and he didn't have to. And to his credit, he looked like he'd rather have been anywhere else in the state. I put 3 retail receipts on his desk. Time stamped at the window after my shift, paid on my own debit card with Pam's clerk number printed right on them. He snorts looked at them for maybe 10 seconds. Then he stacked them, handed them back, and said, 9 years, not one complaint. Go finish your rote. That was the whole meeting. I sat in my car for a minute afterward with my hands on the wheel. And what I felt wasn't anger. It was a kind of cold clarity, because a man who calls your job is a man who has run out of better ideas. Neil texted me that afternoon. I don't want to do it like this. Don't make me. Then 20 minutes later, Dad wasn't right at the end, and you know it. My mother called 3 times that evening and used a different voice each time. The first one was sugar. The second one was about how I'd humiliated her at church. The third one, she was crying so hard I couldn't make out half of it, and she hung up on me before I could say anything back. I answered both of them one time in writing the way I'd answer a customer who yells across the counter. Short, polite, and on paper. I said I loved them. I said I wasn't signing. I said we could talk about it after the holiday. The next afternoon, the first green card came back in my own mail. By Tuesday, the day before Thanksgiving Eve, all 3 receipts were back in my box. Little green cards, the kind I've stuck on 10,000 pieces of mail for other people. Card 1, Underhill Hardwood Wexford, delivered the previous Friday. Signed on the line by Q. Underhill, not a receptionist, the man himself in a hand that slanted hard to the right. Card 2, the estate attorney's office, signed by a legal secretary. Card 3, the title company's intake department with a stamp instead of a signature, which counts. I laid everything out on my kitchen table and put it into one stiff brown accordion folder in the order Ingrid told me. The recorded deed with the county seal on top. The 3 green cards behind it, Odessa's affidavit, the forestry plan with 2 signatures on the landowner line, the assessor's card showing where my father sent the tax bills. And here's what I decided, and I want it on the record because people assume I planned some kind of ambush. I decided I was not going to open that folder at dinner. I was going to leave it under the driver's seat of my car and eat turkey with my family and let the mail do what the mail does the Monday after quietly with no audience. Then my mother called Wednesday morning, sweet as the first day of spring, to make sure I was coming and to ask me to bring the mashed potatoes. And she said, Neil's got some good news for everybody. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and I understood the whole shape of it. He'd picked the table. He was going to stand up in front of the whole table and announce it, because in front of that many people, I'd either have to smile or be the woman who ruined Thanksgiving. He picked the table because he thought a room full of people would keep me quiet. He had never once stood behind me at a counter. I brought a dish of mashed potatoes and a brown accordion folder. Only one of them was for the table. Thanksgiving at the home place on Quarry Road, 210 people. My mother Neil and I and their 2 who are 12 and 8. Yvette's parents who drove up from Cairo and who I have met maybe 6 times. My uncle Verlin, my dad's older brother, 74, who has never in his life said anything he didn't mean. Veith from down the road who has come to this table every year since her husband passed. And me, my grandmother's dishes were out. The ones with the gold rim that come down from the top shelf twice a year, Thanksgiving and Easter. And my mother washes them by hand and won't let anybody help. There was a football game on in the front room with nobody watching it. The kitchen smelled like turkey grease and cigarettes from Yvette's mother sneaking one on the back steps. At the head of the table was my dad's chair, and nobody sat in it, and nobody moved it either. They just talked over the top of it all afternoon like it was a hole in the floor. Everybody had learned to step around. 8 did the seating. She put me at the far end with the kids, and she said it in a bright voice. You're so good with them. Neil filled everybody's glass with sweet tea and stopped behind my uncle's chair and squeezed his shoulder and said, Verlin, I've got something to tell everybody here in a bit. My folder was under the driver's seat of my car, 60 feet away, out past the porch light. My mother tapped the side of her glass with a spoon. My brother stood up with his tea glass in his hand like a man giving a toast at a wedding. He talked about Dad for about half a minute. He said, Dad worked hard. Dad never asked anybody for anything. Dad would have wanted this family taken care of, Ivet's mother said. Amen. Then he went straight into the money the way a salesman slides from your daughter's wedding pictures into the payment plan. He said he'd gotten the background squared away. He said a good outfit out of Wexford was coming in Monday morning with a crew, and it would be done before Christmas. And then he reached into his jacket and took out a check and set it down beside my mother's plate face up and said, "That's the roof, Mom. 14,800. You'll be dry by New Year's." My mother put her hand over her mouth. Et's parents applauded, actually applauded at a dinner table. Mrs. Veith did not clap. She put her fork down and looked at the tablecloth. Verlin didn't move at all. Neil stayed standing, and he looked down the length of that table at me with an expression I can only call generous, and he said, "I know some people are going to feel some kind of way about this, but this is what grown folks have to do." His boy, the 12-year-old, asked whether they were cutting the woods where the creek is. Neil said, "We'll talk about it later, Bud." The 8-year-old asked if the deer stand was coming down. Ivette told them both to eat. My mother put her hand on my brother's arm and looked straight down the table at me. I didn't stand up. I put my fork across my plate and I asked one question in the same voice I used to tell somebody their packages at the annex. I said, "Neil, what did you sign that contract as?" He answered it smooth because he'd said it before to somebody else, representative of the estate. He had Mom's letter of authorization all above board. The lawyers got a copy. I asked the second question. I said, "And what day does it close?" He said, "Monday." Then he added, "And this is the part I want you to hold on to." Why? My mother did not let it get to a third question. She set her hand flat on the table and she said it in her church voice, warm, pitying, loud enough for Yvette's parents at the other end. "Miranda, you don't get land, you get keepsakes. Your father told me that himself." That last part was a lie, not a shading, not a memory gone soft. A lie told about a dead man at his own table, over his own dishes with 9 people listening. And I knew the precise square inch of paper that proved it. Everybody was looking at me. The 12-year-old had stopped chewing. I said, "Excuse me a minute. I need to get something out of my car." The vet said, "Oh, don't make this weird." I said, "I'm not making it weird, Yvette. I'm making it clear." And I got up and went out through the kitchen. Her snorts, the screen door banged once behind me, 60 feet of gravel, and then it banged again. I came back in with a brown accordion folder, and I did not walk to the head of the table. I stood behind my own chair at the kid end where they'd put me and I opened it, and I set things down one at a time, sliding each one toward the middle where the gravy boat was, and I said one short line with each, first the deed with the county seal pressed into the corner, and the document number in ballpoint. Dad signed this 3 days before he died. I recorded it 9 days ago. Second, Odessa Fenn's affidavit. Odie notarized it. That's her statement sworn at the courthouse. Third, the forestry plan. That's his signature, and that's mine 14 months before he passed. Then the fourth thing, I took the green card with Q Underhill's slanted handwriting on it, and I slid it all the way down the table until it stopped against my brother's plate. The mill signed for my letter last Friday. That's his name on it. Neil stood so fast his chair went over backward and hit the door frame. He hit the table with the flat of his hand, and the gold-rimmed dishes jumped, and the sweet tea went across the tablecloth toward Mrs. Veith, who moved her plate without ever taking her eyes off my brother. He said I'd forged it. He said, Dad wasn't right in the head at the end, and everybody at this table knew it. He pointed at me across aft of turkey, and he shouted the thing he'd been saying to me my whole life. Except this time, there was nothing friendly left in it. "You're a mail carrier. You're the one who hands out other people's letters." And I stood there with my hands flat on the back of my chair, and I said it back to him quiet, and I promise you I did not raise my voice 1 inch. "You're right, Neil. I deliver things and you signed for one of them." My mother started to cry and turned to Mrs. Veith and said I had ruined Thanksgiving. And then my brother's phone went off face up on the table beside the gravy, and he looked down at the screen, and he sat down. It was Quentin Underhill calling on Thanksgiving afternoon, which no man does unless something has come apart. Neil answered it with his hand cuped around the phone, and my Uncle Verlin said, "Put it on the speaker, son." And Neil, who had been running that table for 2 hours, did what his uncle told him. Underhill's voice came out flat and tired into that kitchen. He said the title work had come back that morning. He said there was a recorded deed on the tract in another name, and the contract was dead, and he was not sending a crew Monday. And then he said the sentence that took the air out of the room. He said he needed the 40,000 back, the advance he'd paid out in September. And he needed to know by the first of the month how Neil intended to return it. September, 6 days before my father died. My brother took 40,000 against a stand of timber that was never his. My mother said, "What, 40,000? Neil didn't look at her. He didn't answer her either then or ever. And that's when the last piece went in for me sitting there at the kid end of the table. The truck, 206 weeks after we buried Dad out of a shed with a new lock on it. It was never about the battery going bad. The advance was already spent and the skid steer payment came due. He never apologized. He said I'd cost this family 40 zelozen. He said Dad had left behind a mess. Then he got his coat. Yvette followed him to the door and turned around in it, and told me she had only ever tried to keep this family together. And my uncle Verlin stood up at the end of that table. The only person who did. And he said, "Judy, that girl walked those woods with him every fall of her life. You knew that." Under Hillard Wood killed the contract in writing the following Tuesday. And on the 2nd of December, my brother signed a repayment agreement for the 40,000 at their office in Wexford. 3 years. Nobody sued anybody. The check he laid beside my mother's plate came back marked insufficient funds 9 days later. And she found that out from the bank and not from me. And the returned item fee was 35, and she paid it. The skid steer got picked up out of his driveway in February. I had Ingrid draw up one page and I signed it, and my mother signed it at her own kitchen table with the radio on. It says, "My mother lives at the home place for the rest of her life. That I pay the property taxes and the insurance and that the roof gets replaced." It got done the 3rd week of March and it cost 14,200 less than the bid my brother waved around. There is exactly one condition printed on that page. Nobody signs anything concerning those 84 acres but me. She read it twice and she signed it, and she did not cry that time. And afterward she asked me if I wanted the rest of the pumpkin pie to take home. I called EMT Vashon in a December and asked what he had in the truck. He said 9,200 plus 640 for brake work. And then he said he'd take 8 for it because he'd rather it went home. I told him no. I paid him the whole thing over 10 months and I have the payment book. That truck sits in the shed on Quarry Road now with the dent in the driver's door that I put there at 17. In April, I walked the 84 with a can of blue marking paint and a district forester, and we laid out the first selective thinning for the winter after next. I marked the trees myself. Verlin came out and walked about half of it with me and didn't say anything the whole time, which is how he says a lot. Neil didn't come at Christmas. Eat stepped down from the volunteer committee at the church in January. Mrs. Veith still leaves a pumpkin pie in her mailbox for me every November with my name taped to the tin. Not one person in my family has ever said they were sorry. I stopped waiting for that somewhere around the 2nd week of December, and I have been all right since. We had Thanksgiving at my house on Pike Street the next year. 7 people around a table meant for 6. My mother beside Verlin, Mrs. Veith on the end. And nobody had to step around an empty chair because in my kitchen there isn't one. My dad's reading glasses live in my kitchen drawer now. And that scrap of paper is still folded into the temple arm where he left it. And I have never taken it out. He wrote it in his letter. And I'll say it the way he wrote it. I left it to you because you're the one who walks it. And here's the only advice I've got. If somebody in your family keeps telling you what you're going to get someday, ask them where it's written down and who has a copy. Because love that can't survive being put on paper was never a plan, it was just a way to keep you quiet. That's my story. 1 truck, 1 spare tire, and 23 days of keeping my mouth shut. If this reminded you to ask your parents where the deed is, take that as your sign and do it this week. And if you know a woman who's always the one doing the work and never the one deciding, send this to her.